Hi there, my name's Hannah. I'm here today with the Moor Meadows group and we're at this very wonderful location. It's Challicum Farm on Dartmoor, and we're going to look at grass identification. So we're actually really quite high here. We're at 1,300 feet, quite close to the centre of Dartmoor, and this is actually managed as a hay meadow. But despite that, a lot of the grasses that we're finding will actually be found in a whole variety of different habitats and grasslands, so you're likely to find them near you. Right, so here we've got a bouquet of grasses looking beautiful, a whole variety of different species. So I'll just talk about each one as I select them. Firstly, I'm going to talk about this species here because it's quite a good one to be able to identify, if I can untangle it, that is. So this here is perennial ryegrass. It is a species that tends to be sown in meadows that are fields that have been agriculturally improved, though that's not to say that you don't find it in semi-natural grasslands. But it's a good one to recognise because if you have a lot of this species and a lot of white clover, the likelihood is you'll have a grassland that is fairly species poor and has been agriculturally improved in the past. So it's quite a good indicator really. One of the key features when it's in flower are that these spikelets, these individual collections of flowers, on opposite sides of each other as they alternate up the main kind of rachis, the main stem through the flower. So it's quite characteristic really. There are several other species that look similar, but you tend to find those in salty places, or in places that haven't been managed for a long time. So common couch, for example, has a similar structure. Not exactly the same, but similar. Another thing that's quite characteristic about ryegrass is it has a purple staining to the base of the plant, and this helps you be able to identify it at all times of year. And it has a very, very shiny underside of the leaf. So sometimes when you watch wind kind of blow over the surface of a meadow, you can see the shiny underside of the leaves as the wind blows, so it's quite easy to see even at a distance sometimes. So this is perennial ryegrass. There is another species of ryegrass that's also sown in agriculturally improved meadows, and that's Italian ryegrass. It tends to be quite large and vigorous in growth, and it doesn't tend to last very long in the seed bank, so it won't last for very long in the meadow. It kind of tends to live for a short period of time and then the farmers will reseed it. So they're a bit different, but perennial ryegrass is the species that you'd usually come across. This species is Crested Dog Tail, and it tends to be found in semi-improved and species-rich grasslands. And if you look closely at the spike, so the overall flower head, very often you can see the stem of the flower come up to the base of the spike, and then it comes zigzags up through the flower. It's quite a dense grass, and it's not one that you can pull the spikes off. I don't know if anybody else does this, but I very often, as I kind of walk past grasses, pull the flowers off, and there are some species that are really nice to pull off and there's some species that don't pull. This is one of those ones that doesn't really do anything. So it's quite a compact cylindrical flower head and quite characteristic. It also does have quite shiny undersides of the leaves, but tends to look a bit sickly in colour. It has more of a grey coloration, so it's quite easy to tell apart from perennial ryegrass even when it's not in flower. And the base of the plant tends to have a yellowy brown coloration, so it doesn't have the purple like the perennial ryegrass. So they could be muddled, but actually there's some differences even when they're not in flower, but the flowers are very, very different indeed. So that's Crested Dog's Tail. One that's really very easy to pick up, and that's Yorkshire Fog, and lots of people tend to learn this one quite early on. Yorkshire Fog's a very hairy grass. Pretty much every single part of this grass is hairy. The leaves are hairy, the sheaths are hairy, so the sheaths are the part of the grass where the blade joins the stem and kind of wraps around it. So this is the leaf sheath. So this is hairy, the leaf is hairy. The ligules are hairy, and the ligules are these tiny little membranous flaps that are present between the leaf blade and the leaf sheath. And the spikelets also have little hairs on them as well, so it's a very, very hairy grass. So some species of grass are very easy to pull all the spikelets off, and that's something I used to do as a kid as I was wandering along fields or field edges or something. And this species, Yorkshire Fog, is very easy to pull all of those spikelets off. And there was a little rhyme that I had or used to say when I was younger, and that's: here's a tree in summer, here's a tree in winter, here's a bunch of flowers, here's the April showers. So here we've got a huge swathe of Yorkshire Fog. That's the species with the very softly hairy everything. So all the way from the base of the plant right to the tip, it tends to be pretty hairy. And as you can see, it's got this really distinctive lilac-y, mauve-y kind of coloration, and you can actually very often see swathes of this species from quite far away. You'll note actually by looking closely here that Yorkshire Fog looks very different at different stages of its growth. So here we have quite a young specimen. The flower is still quite contracted and it's quite narrow. And as that matures, it'll then start to open out like this one's doing. And if you look really closely when you see plants at this stage, you'll actually notice the flowering parts of the flower are actually out, so you can see the anthers are kind of dangling. And so here this plant's actually being pollinated now, and is the wind's carrying the pollen around. So this is kind of at its active flowering stage, I suppose. And then later on, when the flower starts to contract again and the flower's done its flowering, it kind of becomes slightly paler and contracts again. So as you can see, the different stages of the flower during the season will vary, as is the case with a lot of different grasses. They do change shape, but this probably, because it's quite common, is the one that kind of trips people over the most probably when they're starting to learn. So just bear in mind that sometimes the flower shape changes as you kind of progress through the year, but also as the plant ages. So here, actually very nicely placed next to each other, we have creeping softgrass and Yorkshire Fog. So the Latin names of these will give you an indication that they're very closely related. Yorkshire Fog is Holcus lanatus and creeping softgrass is Holcus mollis. And for the creeping softgrass, you can make out that the nodes, the solid sections that you find in a grass, so very similar to the solid parts of the bamboo cane, have hairs, and so it looks like they've got hairy knees. As opposed to the Yorkshire Fog here, which is hairy all the way up, and the nodes are no more hairy than the sections of the stem either side. So it's very nice to see those two species together. And actually, this shape, I know it's very difficult just to kind of explain something without being specific, but the way this plant is growing is very, very characteristic of creeping softgrass. You can see the leaves are very kind of tightly pressed against the main stem, and that is very characteristic of that species. When it's in flower, it does actually look very similar to Yorkshire Fog, so just bear in mind that this does occur. Yorkshire Fog is also really characteristic when it's not in flower, in that it has stripy pyjamas. So if you look at the base of the plant, you've got purple stripes on a kind of paler sheath, I suppose. So if you look at the end, if it's hairy and it's got the stripy pyjamas, the likelihood is you've probably got Yorkshire Fog. But on the whole, Yorkshire Fog's the more common species, and you tend to find it in a wider variety of habitats. So it's probably Yorkshire Fog if it's softly hairy and it's got the stripy pyjamas. So that's a really common species. And this here is a species, this is a species of fescue. It's a very big fescue actually. Now this fescue is not in its full glory actually. Very often they open, the spikelets open up, and it has a really distinctive kind of well balanced, slightly asymmetrical, mobile look about it. So I think that's really characteristic for fescues on the whole actually. There's two species of fescue that are commonly found that have these needle-like leaves. So the leaves of fescues vary. Some are wide and kind of flat, like a normal leaf as you'd expect, and then some fescue leaves are needle-like. And the two species of fescue with needle-like leaves that you'd expect to find in this kind of habitat are red fescue and sheep's fescue. Sheep's fescue is much more tufted in growth, so it all kind of grows in the same location. And red fescue tends to creep around more, so it's worth looking at how a plant's growing as to what species it is when it comes to those two. There are other characteristics as well, but they're probably a little bit more in detail. So that's a fescue. Okay, so this is Coxfoot, a splendid example of Coxfoot actually. Look at the size of it, beauty. Lots of characteristic features of this species actually. Obviously there's its very, very globular head structure. This is one of those species that you can't pull the florets off. Well, you can, but it takes a lot of yanking. So yeah, and this is a particularly good specimen actually. So very, very globular collection of florets. It has a very keeled white base, and it's quite tufted in its growth, and here you can even see there's lots of vegetative shoots kind of coming from the same location, so it becomes very, very tufted when it's allowed to grow. This species tends to dominate where fields have been left unmanaged for a long period of time, and so if we left this field for 5 to 6 years or something, you'd end up finding this species would start to dominate. And it provides really good habitat for things like barn owls, and because it's great for supporting small mammals, but actually it tends to dominate out the herbaceous species. So on the whole, you lose diversity when this species dominates. So yes, it has a keeled white base, so if you kind of go to the base of the plant and you peel back some of the leaves, you can very often feel that it's very sticky to the touch, and it's quite pale and white in colour as well. The leaves are the leaves are very wide. They tend to have a slightly kind of bluey green colour to them. They've got a large ligule. It's a really good species to actually look at a ligule for starters if you've never seen one before, because they're very big and obvious. And when they're not in flower, so you can see this vegetative shoot here, the sheath is very keeled as well, so you can't roll it very easily between your fingers. So it's very, very characteristic, grows quite large, and its florets create that kind of cock's foot, looks like a cock's foot or a chicken's foot, as well. So there's lots of different features to identify this species with. Then we've got another couple of grasses here. This is actually the same species. This is soft brome. I guess similar to Yorkshire Fog in that it's quite softly hairy. The hairs are a little bit longer though, they're not quite so fine and downy. And the spikelets, these individual kind of collection of flowers, are very, very obvious, and it looks like a brome. I don't know if people are familiar with the kind of spiky bromes that you might find on roadsides and arable field margins, but they have a very distinctive look about them. They've got quite obvious large spikelets, and these are a little bit droopy. And actually soft brome's a nice species because it's so large, you can see features of this particular species that you might not see in other species. So you can see, if you happen to see the species up close, it has these awns, so these tiny little hair-like ends that you find on the glooms, which are these protective shields around the flower. So because it's quite large, you can see all the features close up. So that's actually a really good species actually to find if you want to look at the intricacies of a flowering grass. This unfortunately is not looking as good as it could, but that's only because it's a slightly later flowering grass. So obviously grasses, like other flowers, mature and flower at different stages. So there's one grass that we'll touch on in a second, called sweet vernal grass, which is an early flowering species, and this is quite, well, relatively speaking, a later flowering species. So this is a bent. And bent grasses are really lovely when they come out. The spikelets, those individual cluster of flowers, are very, very tiny, and so when the flowers open out, they give the field a very kind of cloudy, dusty look. And when the flowers brush against your legs, it feels very, very soft and silky. So you'll kind of know that one when you come across it. And the two species of bent that you're more likely to come across are common bent and creeping bent. Creeping bent tends to be found in wetter places, though it's not restricted to wetter places, and common bent tends to be found in drier places. The easiest way to tell these two species apart is the ligule length. So as I mentioned before, the ligule is a membranous piece of material that's found at the join between the leaf blade and the leaf sheath at this point here. And the ligule length for creeping bent is longer than it is wide, and for common bent it's shorter than it is wide. So on the whole, really, it just depends whether you can see the ligule obviously or not. And for this species I can't see the ligule very clearly, which would indicate that it's common bent. And common bent is a bit more tufted in its growth, and creeping bent creeps. So again, that can be really useful to help with identification as well. And these are very common species, but they're quite fine-leaved, and you do tend to find them in abundance in these kind of species-rich meadows. Although we can't see a huge amount of this in flower currently, it would be one of the dominant grasses in this meadow. So in a month or so, there'll be a lot of this in flower. So that's a bent. So just mentioned earlier, sweet vernal grass, which is this one, and as you can see, it's looking a bit sad. It's done its thing. It's looking a bit kind of brown, and that's because it is one of the earliest grasses that flower in grassland habitats. Vernal actually refers to the spring. Refers to a spring, really, so the fact it's a spring flowering species. This is it's kind of also got a dense floret. It's a bit, I kind of describe it as a spiky torpedo, which probably doesn't really, I don't know if it's a great description, but it's cylindrical, but it is quite spiky towards the tip. And it's worth noting actually that this species can differ depending if you're finding it in a shady location or a bright sunny location. So if you find it in a bright sunny location, it tends to look like this kind of very dense torpedo kind of shape. But if you find it in a woodland where it's slightly shaded, the florets tend to kind of spike out, and it looks very, very different. So the same species can look slightly different depending on where you find it. This species is a really characteristic species for a number of reasons. If you yoink out the plant and you sniff it straight away, it's a bit late now. Oh no, I can still smell it. The roots smell a bit like germaline. Some people have described it smelling as coconut, but I think it probably smells a bit germaline. It's quite medicinal. And the chemical that creates that scent is actually something called coumarin, and that is also found in meadowsweet, sweet woodruff. So there's a lot of species that kind of have that chemical within the structure, and I'm not exactly sure what it does, but it must be useful because there's a lot of species that have it, but it has a very, very characteristic scent. So that can be really useful with identification. Another thing about sweet vernal grass is that it has nostril hairs. So if you look really closely for this species, again at this super duper kind of exciting area, which is where the ligule is, there's a lot kind of that goes on here, and it has hairs that kind of come out at varying lengths and angles from this point, and so it looks a little bit like an unkempt nostril, I suppose, or unkept nostril. So there's lots of different hairs coming out in lots of different directions. So one way of remembering sweet vernal grass is it has nostrils, nostril hairs. So that's a nice characteristic species, and again it's quite fine in nature. The leaves are quite fine, and again you'll find a huge amount of it in this meadow, particularly in spring when it's really obvious. So that's sweet vernal grass. This is called Timothy. Timothy is very similar to another grass which we don't have here unfortunately, so I can't make that direct comparison, though hopefully we'll find it as we wander around. It has a cylindrical flower head, and it isn't spiky towards the tip, so it's more it's more of a kind of rounded cylinder, I suppose. If you look really closely at the spikelets for Timothy, it actually looks like it has devil horns. So there's two spiky horns at the end of each spikelet, which is very characteristic for this species. It also has other features that are worth keeping your eyes peeled for. The leaves are quite wide, the ligules are fairly long, and the sheaths, I'm not sure if you can make it out here, but the sheath, this part here, is often a little bit baggy, not excessively so, but a little. And also Timothy very often has bulbous base, so it looks a bit onion-like towards the end, so that's also quite characteristic for Timothy as well. This species can be sown in agriculturally improved fields, but you don't always find it in improved fields. You can find it in unimproved and semi-improved grasslands as well. So Timothy is quite a nice characteristic species. Meadow foxtail, which does look similar to this, tends to flower a lot earlier in the year, so that tends to be quite a spring flowering species, and it doesn't have devil horns. It has one horn that pokes out, and it's much more soft to the touch, and it looks more silky as well, so they are actually quite different. But yeah, Timothy's a nice easy one to pick up on. Another grass to keep your eyes peeled for is rough meadow grass. There's 3 species of meadow grass that you might find on your grass hunts. Rough meadow grass, smooth meadow grass, and annual meadow grass. Annual meadow grass is usually quite short, say about 15 centimetres tall, and it flowers all year round. And so if you see little grass flowering in the winter, the likelihood is it's annual meadow grass. Rough meadow grass and smooth meadow grass you tend to find in meadows. Rough meadow grass I find is the most common of the two, and this is the flower of that species. And as you can tell, to me it looks a little bit like a Christmas tree. The overall panicle, so the overall flower, has a very kind of triangular shape, and the triangle was definitely broadest at the base, where for a lot of other grasses the panicle shape is narrow, then widens, and then narrows again. So this kind of triangular shape is quite characteristic for me. The spikelets are quite small but not tiny, and it can grow quite large, as you can see here, but you can also find it as a very small grass. So that's worth keeping your eyes peeled for. One of the main characteristics between smooth meadowgrass and rough meadowgrass is the roughness of the sheath. So this section here, so where the leaf joins the top of the sheath, if you rub that on your upper lip, you can find that it has rough patches on. So that's characteristic for rough meadowgrass, and the smooth meadowgrass in theory is supposed to have a smooth sheath. And there are some other characteristics too, but that's probably a good starting point. It's worth mentioning this species here and this species here. So firstly, this isn't a grass. It is actually wind pollinated, so grasses are wind pollinated. So it does have that similarity, and I guess it looks fairly similar to a grass in that it's a flower on a long stalk, but this is actually Ribwork plantain, and the leaf of Ribwork plantain is this. So if you followed this down, in theory you should find this leaf here, which I suppose is similar to a grass in that the leaf is long and thin, and it has these parallel veins, but it's actually like a broad-leaved herbaceous species, so isn't actually grass. You start your grass hunts, this might cause a bit of confusion to start with. And then on the same note, this is a sedge. So sedges aren't grasses either, but again they might be mistaken for a grass. Sedges tend to like wet places, but they don't always like wet places. This isn't particularly wet, this is fairly dry, and this species grows here. Sedges tend to have a growth pattern of 3, so when the leaves come out of the ground, they tend to grow out in a pattern of 3, where for grasses, when they grow, the leaves are opposite each other, and that tends to be a pattern that's quite characteristic, generally speaking. Sedges have clusters of flowers, so in this example you've got lots of male flowers together on this final spikelet, and then you have the female flowers together here, and although that's not the case for all sedges, they do actually, when you look close to them, they do actually look quite different to a grass, and that growth pattern is quite useful. And like I said about the growth pattern of 3, so the leaves grow out in 3 different directions. The actual stem itself is triangular as well, so that kind of growth pattern goes all the way through the plant, I suppose. And another thing about sedges, I mentioned the triangular stem, that gives the rhyme, I suppose, or the way of remembering. Sedges have edges, so if you roll this between your fingers you can really feel the triangular edges on the stem, and that's pretty much the case for all sedges. Sometimes the triangular shape and cross-section is much more severe, so you can really feel the edges, and sometimes they're slightly rounded, but more often than not you can feel that kind of triangular cross-section when you roll it. If you do find a sedge, the likelihood is you've probably got a nice grassland. Sedges are quite picky, and there's not many of them that grow in species poor communities, so sedges actually are very often a good indicator of good habitat.